Hey everyone, we have a special presentation of some of our earlier podcasts. We have episode 9 and episode 10, part 1 and 2 of Urban Mallard Research with Dr. Ben O'Neill. I think everyone will find this one really interesting because it relates to basically city-dwelling mallards and whether or not hunters are actually harvesting these urban ducks. So give this one a listen. I think you'll really like it.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
I am really excited about what we have to bring to you today. We're going to be speaking with Dr. Ben O'Neill from Franklin College in Franklin, Indiana. Ben is going to be sharing with us some updates from some really exciting research into urban mallards that they've been conducting here over the past few years. But first, I want to welcome Ben to the show. Ben, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really honored to be a part.
To get us started here, why don't you tell us a little bit about where you are, what role you have there at Franklin College, and what you have, what your background is and your interest.
Great, love to. So I'm a wildlife ecology professor here at Franklin College, which is a small liberal arts college just south of Indianapolis in central Indiana. And over the course of the last decade, I've been really fortunate to get to work with a group of energetic undergraduate students who are in our ecology and conservation track. And it's a really perfect place for me to leverage my interests and my passion for waterfowl conservation and research to be able to kind of ignite an interest in undergraduates and hopefully equip them to be ecologists and conservationists in a variety of different fields, different ways, and be just really capable scientists and thinkers. And if a few of them end up becoming full-time duck biologists, I'd be pretty thrilled about that too. So here in central Indiana, we're kind of mid-latitude within the Mississippi Flyway, and so we have, just like every region, have our own kind of unique set of monitoring and research and conservation opportunities and challenges that's unique to our geography, right? And so we sit right on the fringe of greater Indianapolis, which is a really booming, growing metro area. And then we also did a significant part of this work that I'll tell you about over in Champaign-Urbana. Those partnerships started when I was doing graduate work there a little over a decade ago, with the University of Illinois and Illinois Natural History Survey. And so we've been fortunate to partner with some other researchers there as well for this project. And so my work as a professor here at Franklin College has given me an opportunity to work alongside some of our managers with the Department of Natural Resources who have applied questions, right, that they need answered in order to be able to effectively manage the resource, the duck and the goose and the swan research or management that happens here. And one of the things that our state waterfowl biologist and I have been talking about for many years was the significant number of mallards in particular that exist within urban and suburban landscapes here in our home state and honestly throughout the continent. And so that just kind of sparked some curiosity and some questions that then has built into a full-on research project.
I want to back up a little bit. We're going to talk about that research here in just a minute, but your background a little bit, you and I have known one another for probably 10 or 15 years now, and I do recall you were in Southern Illinois, right?
University of Illinois.
University of Illinois. Okay, and so you did quite a bit of work on migration ecology of waterfowl in that region. You actually did some rather pioneering work on the use of weather radar to track waterfowl migrations through that region. So you have quite a diversity of experience and expertise that you can kind of bring to a lot of these questions that I think are going to be of interest to our listeners. So, yeah, I just wanted to share that, let folks know that you're not a spring chicken. You've been studying waterfowl ecology in that region for well over a decade.
I appreciate that. Pioneering is a generous description of it, but it certainly was some really, I think, intriguing opportunities to start to answer questions about large-scale movements using some tools like weather radar and portable radar, and trying to just understand some of the spatial dynamics of ducks as they move across the landscape, and how those movement patterns influence our management, our conservation. And so, it's been a neat kind of continuation of some of that work to now start thinking about some of these questions that we'll talk about here today.
The transitioning from those larger scale movements down to birds that at least on the surface you probably think are pretty localized, those being the urban mallards, are going to be the focus of this discussion. So that is pretty neat sort of transition. And whenever you and I first talked about this a couple of weeks ago at the North American Duck Symposium, and I'll confess, whenever I first saw the title of your presentation, I thought that I was going to know the answer to what you found. I figured, okay, well, yeah, urban mallards, they're probably just going to find they're hanging around those the cities, and maybe they'll wander outside the city limits a little bit. But then you and I got to talking, and it was actually not that at all. I was completely surprised to learn of some of the results. So we want to share some of those results with our listeners. I know this is going to be really interesting because as you already introduced, the landscape across North America, across the world, is becoming increasingly urbanized, and so these urban mallards, these urban ducks, are some of the most direct interactions that a lot of people have with waterfowl, and I think it's really interesting to start to learn about this. So with that, I'm going to ask you to sort of talk a little bit about how you got. You've already introduced a bit about how this got started, but tell us a little bit about the research. What are the objectives, and kind of how are you going about trying to answer these objectives?
Yeah, so it really, like you said, started with some simple observations that a lot of naturalists and hunters are keenly aware of, which is that different times of year you find really significant numbers of ducks and geese in these developed landscapes, and so trying to, as a collaborator along with state and federal biologists, we're always trying to think about how do we comprehensively think about the waterfowl resource in our region at different times of year, and more in areas like central Indiana, that broader resource includes these urban birds, and so naturally we start to wonder, okay, are these birds, first of all, how abundant are they? Can we start to quantify those abundances? And second of all, if they are abundant at meaningful levels, what are they doing? Are they really staying in the same spot? And you'll hear a lot of folks kind of comment on that anecdotally. You'll hear references to city birds and how they behave. But then there's also curiosities of individuals wondering, are these birds doing more vigorous things on the landscape? And so we set out just to try to address those questions using a fairly simplistic approach, and that was intentional, both from a budget standpoint, but also from the ability to translate the research in a way that invited my students as undergraduates to participate in the development of the methods and the interpretation of the data, and then the communication of the data to the public in a way that was intuitive and accessible. And so we used a pretty basic traditional leg banding approach to look at where birds move and when they're harvested and things like that. And so our aim was to determine, do they move outside of the city limits? Do they contribute to harvest? And if so, what kind of habitats are they being encountered in by hunters?
So we have this picture here. We have these urban mallards that a lot of folks interact with, and we're just trying to answer the fundamental question of, how many are there? Where are they going? Are they available for harvest? And what are the other interesting questions that or interesting behaviors of these birds? And so with that as the background, you guys you started this when about 3 or 4 years ago? Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. And we started in two areas, that East Central Illinois in the Champaign-Urbana complex, and here in the 9-county region of Indianapolis and in the surrounding suburban counties here central Indiana.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about the methods that you employ. You've referenced banding, but let's get into the details. How did you catch these birds? Where did you catch them? What time of the year did you catch them?
Yeah, great question. So we were working in the post-breeding, post-hatch period in June and July, primarily here in our latitude, and we're working in these suburban communities. So we're in backyards that have residential ponds. We're in golf courses. We're in wastewater treatment plants. We're sometimes in stream corridors that move through towns, and a variety of other, a lot of corporate ponds that exist on a lot of the commercial and retail complexes within these areas. And so we would canvass these counties, and we would find meaningful, kind of congregations of birds. We'd engage with landowners to get formal permission, and then we would spend anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks baiting birds. These are adults and hatchier juvenile birds, getting them comfortable with an area, and then we would kind of gradually start to build out what we call a walk-in trap, which is a pretty simple cage-style trap with funnels in it, and we get them acclimated to that, and then when the time is right, we bait the trap carefully, put the funnels in place, and then leave it set for just a short period of time to try to catch as many birds, and then not leave them in there to stress them for any extended period of time. And then we go retrieve them, and we document, the sex and the age, the condition in some cases, some morphometrics, and then we fit them with a leg band and we let them go. And that's when the data collection process starts from there.
So were these birds flightless at this time, or was it a mix of both?
It's a mix of both. Yep.
When you're catching them. Okay.
Yep, a mix of both. And right during that June-July window, you'll see the males and the females engaging in that molt throughout that period.
Yeah, so so you encountered entirely different situations from what we normally, at least in entirely different levels of acclimatization of these birds from what we see in normal wild birds, right? You wouldn't be able to use that kind of approach with flighted birds in the wild, would you?
Well, that's a good question. Corn is a powerful attractant, and so. If you put bait out, yeah, I mean, in fact, this style of trap is used to band, migrant scaup on the Mississippi River. Not a walk-in trap, but a swim-in trap that's functionally the same thing, right? And so, it's putting out an energy-rich food source, letting them find it, get habituated to it, and then having them enter a one-way trap. So it's really not unlike the methods used elsewhere. So I think to your question, the capture methodology was not predicated on them being habituated to human contact. So the majority of these birds still have some level of aversion to human interaction. So they would flush off of sites. Certainly, there are some situations where they're behaving like the park ducks that are familiar with white bread. But the vast majority, 95% of these birds or more, behave just as kind of wildly and skittishly as you would expect any wild duck to.
Interesting. Okay, and so you shared a few notes with me before we got on the podcast here. So I'll reference some of this. So over those 3 years, you captured and banded over 2,200 mallards. It looks like 86 locations from 9 counties across Illinois and Indiana. And as you've alluded to, these were heavily urbanized locations, not like out in a cornfield or out in some semi-wild location, like in backyards and commercial areas.
Yeah, and interestingly, so all of our trap sites were actually within annexed city limits. So in terms of like the legal jurisdiction of cities, towns, and villages, all of our trap sites fell within those city limit boundaries.
So these are not going to be birds that would have migrated down, would not have migrated into the city. These are pure urban birds.
Yep,
okay.
and we constrained our trapping to try to make sure that we didn't confound the sample with long distance migrant birds. So by doing it right there during the brood rearing period in the central part of the summer, we were able to say with confidence that these were local birds. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, we've sort of set the stage here with we have these 2,200 birds that have been banded, and then we're going to use those band recoveries to determine where they've been harvested, how far and in which directions have they distributed.
Great. Yeah. So one of the cool things about banding studies is that anticipation once you've deployed the bands of not knowing exactly what's going to unfold. And one of the things that made me really excited about this work is that when I talked to really knowledgeable waterfowl biologists in the Midwest, I would ask them, so here's what we're doing. What do you think we're going to find? What percentage of these birds are going to get harvested? Is it 1%, 5, 10, 25, 50? And there was a lot of, when they were honest, they said, that's a great question. We don't know how frequently these urban birds get harvested and how much they contribute to our statewide harvest in these different regions. And so we had a genuine, sincere curiosity that first year and then all the subsequent years of what was going to unfold. And so as they started, we get a weekly band report from the USGS Bird Banding Lab, and week by week, as the different hunting seasons would open and start to get into kind of the heart of their seasons, we'd start to get this steady trickle and then a pretty consistent flow of hunter harvested birds from our sample. And the short of it is that, over the course of the 4 years that followed, a meaningful number of these birds were getting encountered by hunters. To this point in time, we've had 183 hunter harvested birds, and those numbers are going to continue to increase, particularly as a lot of Midwestern duck seasons get ready to open here in the next month or two.
Okay, so 103 hunter harvested. 183 hunter harvested returns. So looking at our numbers here, that's and we're going to kind of throw some numbers at some folks here. 8.2% recovery rate. That's over the entire 3 years of the study, right? That's what we refer to as direct and indirect. So let's talk a little bit about that. I think this will be interesting. Sometimes we talk about direct recoveries and indirect recoveries. So tell us just a little bit about the most basic. What are we talking about when we say that?
Yeah, a direct recovery is just a bird that's harvested within the same annual cycle, the same season. So in our case, they're birds that we band in June or July and then get harvested sometime October through January in that same year. And then indirect recoveries are birds that are harvested in subsequent years after, at least one annual cycle has elapsed. And so, for the purposes of some studies, you just merge all that together. You just want to know, what birds were harvested, period. Mm-hmm. The reason that we sometimes split out that direct recovery is that some of our population and harvest modeling that occurs at the continental level specifically targets the direct recovery rate for a variety of kind of analytical reasons. And so we do sometimes look at those separately, but for the purpose of this study, right now we're looking at a little bit more than an 8% recovery rate of those 2,200 bands, as you said.
Okay, so we have an 8.2% recovery rate. And what does that translate to in terms of a harvest rate?
Somewhere around 73% of mallard bands get reported.
73% of the birds, or the bands of the birds with a band that are shot and recovered by the hunter are reported. So in other words, there's like 27% of those banded birds that are recovered by the hunter, but that are not reported, right? So we have to correct for that to get from recovery rate to harvest rate. So, and we have ways to calculate that reporting rate, but that's why it's really important for hunters to report their bands. This information is really vital for estimating with greater confidence these harvest rates, which are used in the analytical models that you referenced. So we go from an 8.2% recovery rate to an 11.2% harvest rate for these birds, and I think that's quite comparable to harvest rates for wild mallard populations, is it not?
You're right. Yeah, and that in and of itself, we were kind of pleased to see, not necessarily to see any particular result, but we were intrigued, I guess, by that result, that these birds that are thought of by a fair number of biologists and hunters as pretty sedentary birds are actually active and moving about the landscape in ways that result in comparable harvests, like you said, between mallards from the Prairie Pothole region to these birds that are hatched in under someone's bush in their backyard.
The Ducks Unlimited Expo, May 15th, 16th, and 17th, 2020 at the Texas Motor Speedway in Fort Worth, Texas. Interactive villages, shooting, archery, dogs, fishing, kayak, canoe, 4x4 off-road tracks, ATV, UTV track, industry experts, demonstrations, exhibitors, and more. The Ducks Unlimited Expo, everything outdoors. The ultimate playground for the outdoor enthusiast. The Ducks Unlimited Expo. Visit www.duckexpo.com.
The new position I have with DU, I get some of those calls, about a bird that's a hen mallard that's nesting in someone's flower pot. And I kind of make some assumptions about, well, that's just sort of a strange bird. They do weird things whenever they're in the urban environment. And that may be true, but now your research is telling us that, hey, these birds are actually going out there and they're available for harvest, and they're available for harvest pretty much at a rate that the same rate we see for wild, truly wild populations of mallards, which is fascinating. And
among those 183 birds that we've had harvested by hunters and reported, one of the things that struck us right away is that these birds are moving from the various trap sites, and there were about 86 locations that they were banded at across the central Indiana region and east central Illinois, and all that was within these urban areas. But one of the things that struck us immediately when we started getting band returns was how they scattered across the region. And so about half of them were harvested locally within 10 kilometers, or about 6 miles of their respective trap sites. But then another half of them moved greater distances than that. About 30% of them moved kind of moderate distances between 6 and 62 miles, and then about 20% of them actually moved a considerable distance away from their trap site, went on these long distance movements. And so we were really just, I don't know, intrigued by that so many of them didn't simply jump into the nearest cornfield and get harvested there, but they were blasting around the region in a variety of directions and a variety of distances.
Yeah, so geographically speaking, what did you learn about where they went? Any particular bias, in terms of their direction, or what did you learn in that regard?
These birds are banded in the summer. They're recovered in the fall, and so they're both of the regions that we were working in, Indiana and Illinois, are kind of mid-latitude, and so you might expect that harvested birds in the fall and winter are going to move south, right? And you would see this kind of trend of these southerly movements. But we didn't find that. There was zero trend in the direction that they moved. They were, if you look at a map, they're just scattered throughout the Midwest. They were harvested in 3 Canadian provinces and 9 different U.S. states around the north central Midwest part of the continent. And so they went all kinds of places, and actually, the one pattern that did exist in terms of where they went was that of those birds that went a moderate or long distance, many of them, 56% of them, actually went in some kind of a northerly direction rather than a southerly direction. And so that was a bit surprising to us.
Ben, was that even for those birds that were harvested in the year following their banding, or were those movements more likely to occur in subsequent years?
That's a combination of both the direct recoveries in that same year and the indirect recoveries. So we found young hatchier birds that would make these long distance movements post fledging, but we also found some indirect recoveries of birds that had gone through an annual cycle and then were recovered. And so when I've shared that with other folks, so mallards are repairing every year, and so it's possible we can speculate in some cases that an individual might have become paired with a bird from a more distant region and perhaps then migrated during spring migration to a more distant region. But we don't really fully understand all those mechanisms yet. Some of it's molt migration, some of it's just some basic dispersal from the natal area, and some of it perhaps is pair bonding that draws individuals to more distant areas.
Okay, so this has been going on for 3 years. So I was going to ask you if you had any birds of a particular, particularly old birds that were harvested, but you probably don't have any of that. I will ask you, in any of your capture efforts, when you were trying to catch these birds, did you happen to come across birds that were already banded?
Actually, no. So no other mallards that had been banded by previous studies. So we spent 3 years in Illinois and 3 years in Indiana, and the way they overlapped, it was a total of 4 calendar years, 2015 through 2018. And so we certainly had recaptures that we observed and studied from our own study, but we actually did not encounter a single marked bird from any previous work at all. But to your point about the age, that's kind of one of the fun things of these projects is that here now in this 5th year of the study where we'll be analyzing the returns, we will start to get some estimates of the age of some of these birds based on how long they've carried that band until they were harvested.
Yeah, and survival rates on any of these birds. Have you, we've talked about harvest rates, but that's just one component of mortality that birds face. Have you, with just a few years into this data set, you probably don't have very much data to work with there, but have you been able to generate some preliminary survival estimates, annual survival estimates?
We're really eager to do that. We just now are getting to the sample size where we can, with any kind of integrity, start to estimate that. So here we just presented some of the initial results at the Duck Symposium that we talked about last episode, and our intention is we have this one more year of the grant to analyze returns, and then our intention will be to kind of complete some of that final analysis, including annual survival rates, and try to publish that work for the public and for the scientific community here.
I think that's going to be a fascinating question in itself to see how those annual survival rates would differ between that urban component, that urban population, and the wild population of mallards. I certainly know what I would hypothesize the result is going to be, but I know what I would have hypothesized coming into the research that you're describing now, and I would have been wrong.
They meet all kinds of different sources of stress and mortality, and even their fecundity is totally different, and at least I shouldn't say totally different. It has the potential to be totally different because of the differing environments that they exist in.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about what's next. You've introduced that, and you have another year of the funding to do this. Are you going to try to secure funding to continue the banding work as it's being conducted, or as you've been conducting it, or are you going to try to expand this? One of the things that comes to my mind, and I know you've thought about it, is, boy, it would sure be nice to see what these urban birds are doing on an individual basis and on a finer spatial scale, and so that speaks to some telemetry. So what's next for this work?
Great, yeah. So we're wrapping up this 4th year of the Pittman-Robertson grant here with the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. It's a federal aid and wildlife restoration grant. So we have a lot of sportsmen and sportswomen out there to thank for their support of this kind of work. This grant, we'll put a bow on it, so to speak, with a final report here in the next year. But we already have plans in place to start to address some of those questions that you've mentioned. I want to get a lot better bead on the demographics, like the reproductive rates within these systems, to be able to look at nest success and fledging success to help inform that. Certainly, I'd like to get some better estimates of survival. We already are starting to build out some monitoring protocols to help us get reliable estimates of abundances, not only from these 2 study areas in Indiana and Illinois, but hopefully a bit more broadly in a way that helps us understand, okay, if we estimate these many mallards exist in a 9-county region of central Indiana, for example, can we translate that more broadly, extrapolate it geographically to other states? Because Indiana is not unique. There's tons of suburban counties across U.S. and Canada.
Yeah, and these urban areas are not included in our annual breeding population survey efforts for the most part, right?
That's correct. Generally speaking, that's right. In Indiana, our state managers with the DNR do some monitoring of mallards during spring and summer surveys, but it's very, very unique. It's not, to your point, it's not included in federal monitoring, for example, the May pond counts and breeding pair counts and things like that. So yes, one of those simple goals is to try to ramp up the abundance estimates in a way that helps us extrapolate to broader scales to then help provide some information for flyways and joint ventures as they try to understand the potential contribution of these urban reservoirs of population to the broader flyways. Yeah, and then certainly as telemetry technology becomes more affordable and scaled down in size, I'd love to be able to look at some of the individual movements at finer scales, as you said, and really seek to understand how these birds are interacting even with other migratory segments of the population. We're excited to start to get some of that going. And if we have time here today, I'd love to tell you about I had a conversation with a big group of biologists at the Mississippi Flyway Council meeting back in August in Duluth. Yeah, and that was a collaborative planning meeting that was participated in by biologists and researchers from Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and the goal there is of that study, under the leadership of Dave Lukanen there at Michigan State. The goal of that study is to answer some really important questions about Great Lakes mallards. And so I presented this urban work there at that Flyway meeting, and one of the things that became clear to those folks is that the urban mallard component is a significant component potentially within that broader Great Lakes mallard population. So we are developing a collaborative proposal. I'm just really delighted to be a contributor to that, not leading that work, but it's great that there's folks from the academy, from state natural resource agencies, and from the federal government that are talking together about, hey, how can we leverage our resources to try to understand these questions in the broadest way possible. And so that proposal is already drafted, and it's being developed in a robust way. And we're going to hopefully my team here will be able to contribute some of that, some of the effort and some of the data regarding urban mallards to help really ramp that up in spatial scale.
And so that work that you're talking about that's proposed, would that focus on urban mallards across a larger geography, or is it focusing on, would it encompass work on mallard populations in general across that Great Lakes region?
Good question. Yeah, the primary scope of that is Great Lakes mallards in general, but the acknowledgement from that team is that the urban population segment is an unknown percentage of that population, and in order to effectively speak to population trajectories and trends in that Great Lakes population, they're recognizing that we probably need to get our heads around the behavior and the population dynamics of the urban segment, because it could be significant and a potentially growing component of that broader segment.
Are there any other projects of this nature, where the studies of urban ducks, I know there are studies of urban geese. I actually listened to a presentation at the Duck Symposium up in Toronto tracking urban Canada geese. But any other work related to urban ducks across North America that you're aware of, or is this sort of the first of its kind in a contemporary era?
Colleagues up in Michigan, Barb and Don Avers and their team have also been banding some urban mallards. Their work is not, it didn't originate with a singular focus on urban mallards. They were simply trying to ramp up their state banding effort on mallards in general. And over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, they've come to realize that there's a lot of mallards to be marked in these urban areas. And so they've done a really impressive job of effectively capturing and marking urban mallards up there, and for example, in the East Lansing metro complex and the Grand Rapids metro complex, among others. And so, yes, there are folks that are marking some urban mallards. That's the primary one that I'm aware of. I'd be shocked if there weren't some other folks doing a bit of this work on the East Coast and the West Coast, perhaps even in the South. There's just it's really a phenomenon that's, I think, pretty ubiquitous across the continent. And so I think we may be one of the few that are really dialed in on the targeted questions. But I am excited to say that we're looking for any other folks that are also interested and trying to connect the dots so we can work together to answer this question as best we can.
Well, this is really exciting work. You've mentioned a few other things already that I would love to dive in more details on, but I'm going to resist the urge to do that, particularly the idea of surveying these birds in an urban environment. And that's something that once your conversations with your state resource agency partners, once that continues and moves a little bit farther along, I'd love to get you back on and hear about how those efforts are going and any progress that's being made in figuring out how to survey these birds and what we might be learning with regard to the abundance, across a larger geography. So we'll save that for another time. But clearly, the research that you've been engaged in here is a reflection of the fact that the landscapes in which we live and the landscapes upon which waterfowl depend are constantly changing. Our world is becoming increasingly urbanized, and that affects not only us, but it affects waterfowl habitats, and it affects waterfowl populations, and it affects waterfowl populations, namely mallards and Canada geese, would be some of the most obvious, in a way that's very visible to us. And I think this research provides a great connection for people to the resource. So I'm going to give you sort of the last word here, Ben, and share with us some of your insights on what you think this research means and why it's important to people, why it's important to the waterfowl resource and those that care about it. So what's been some of the biggest takeaways for you from this?
Yeah, I appreciate that opportunity. In our experience over those 4 years, we talked to hundreds and hundreds of folks that live in these communities, and we found an overwhelming love for mallards. And one of the takeaways that I didn't expect was just how well suited the mallard is to be a positive catalyst to engage the public in waterfowl conservation and education, environmental education in general. That was really a cool outcome. And then in terms of translating some of this work to hunters and conservationists that are passionate about waterfowl, I love to invite those that I just mentioned to start thinking about ducks and geese in richer ways. So a lot of us, like me, we love to spend time in the wild marshes and prairies of our continent, but we also spend a considerable amount of our time in developed regions. And so I'm just trying to encourage folks to recognize that the birds we interact with in those developed regions are not independent of the birds that we see in these wild, remote natural areas that we all love and fight for and want to conserve. And in fact, there's actually this really cool kind of sophisticated intermingling of these groups of birds. And so just excited to see folks maybe opening their eyes to that reality and providing some data that informs that in really concrete ways. And hopefully, as we all are working, I think, to try to protect natural landscapes and try to add habitat in our home regions. But there's a certain amount of development that is just inherent in our society. And so what I'm encouraging others to think about is how can we kind of acknowledge and reconcile that development, and then also make the most of it by appreciating the wildlife that lives there and understanding them, in this case mallards, and then in some cases even appreciating them from a hunting standpoint as they contribute to harvest as well.
Great points, Ben. You and I could talk about this for another half hour, I guarantee you. We haven't even really talked about habitats that you found these birds using and things of that nature, and so we're gonna leave that for yet another time. But
well, I just invite folks to stay tuned on that. We're eager to share the work, and so we'll try to find as many outlets as we can to share that work for folks that are interested in it. And
I'm going to stay in touch with you on it, and we'll probably have you back on once some of this other information has been summarized and the data has been analyzed. So we'll definitely keep in touch on that. Thanks so much for joining us, Ben. This has been fantastic. thank you for your contributions. Thank you for the work that you're doing to help us better understand waterfowl and waterfowl populations.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.